So I'm Edouard Machery, and I'm a professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. Genoveva, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Genoveva Marti, and I'm now an ICREA research professor at the Logic Department of the University of Barcelona. However, starting July, I'm going to be teaching at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Back to you.
Good. So today the reason why we're here is because the two of us wrote chapters in a book which has just been published called Current Controversies in Experimental Philosophy. It's published by Routledge and it was edited by Elizabeth O'Neill from the University of Pittsburgh and by myself. You can buy it right now on Amazon or on the Routledge website. And in these chapters, we talk about meaning, reference, and what I like to call semantic epistemology. The semantic epistemology is just a theory about how we can have justified belief or how we can theorize in the right way about meaning, about reference, about semantic properties in general. And the source of today's discussion is going to be a paper that was published in 2004 in Cognition, a journal in psychology, by Steve Stitch from Rutgers, Sean Nichols from the University of Arizona, Ron Mallon from Washington University at St. Louis, and myself. And in that paper, we looked at people's judgments about reference. Now, to understand the goal of that paper, it's useful to give you a little bit of background and to refresh your memory about a key debate in the philosophy of language. So, in the philosophy of language, traditionally, you had two main families of theories about reference, about how words refer to what they refer. Descriptivist theories of reference and causal historical theories of reference. Descriptivist theories of reference roughly endorse the following two ideas. A word, for example, a proper name, is associated with a description, and a description just specifies a set of properties. That's the first idea. A proper name is associated with a description. And the second idea is that an object is the referent of a proper name if and only if it uniquely or best satisfies that proper name. So for example, take the proper name Barack Obama. So Barack Obama, according to descriptivist theories of reference, is as the proper name Barack Obama is associated with a description. And for example, the 44th president of the United States of America. And an individual in the world is the referent of that proper name because that individual is the unique individual who satisfies the description, the 44th president of the United States of America. Right? So we have a description, and then we have an individual who satisfies the description, and the proper name refers to that individual because that individual satisfies the description. A first family of theories about reference. Another family of theories about reference, a very different kind of family, are causal historical theories of the kind developed by Kripken and Michael David, for example. So, according to causal historical theories, when a speaker introduces for the first time a proper name in a linguistic community, in a language, that speaker has an intention to refer to a specific individual. So, for example, when Barack Obama's mother, for example, or father introduced the proper name Barack Obama, he or she has an intention to refer to a specific individual. Now, that word then was transmitted within the linguistic community. A second speaker inherited that first word from Barack Obama's mother or Barack Obama's father. A third speaker inherited that proper name from a second speaker, and so on and so forth, until us nowadays, modern users of the proper name Barack Obama. So when we use the proper name Barack Obama, we refer to the source of this causal historical chain, right? To the individual which is at the origin of this causal or historical chain. Another way to put the same point is that we refer to the individual the first speaker, the one who introduced the proper name, intended to refer to. Right? Now, I, as a speaker, may associate a description with the proper name Barack Obama. I may. But that description plays no role in fixing the referent of the proper name Barack Obama. All right? So that's the second kind of family. In the first kind of family, description and the satisfaction of description plays an important role in fixing the referent. In the second kind of family, causal historical theories of reference, what matters is a causal historical chain between modern users of a word, of a proper name, and the source of this proper name, the first use of that proper name. All right, so that's the two families of theories of reference. Do you agree with that way of setting the contrast, Genoveva?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Let me just say one thing, one minor point, which is subtle, but I think it's important. I wouldn't say perhaps that according to the causal historical picture, people refer to the person that the first user of the name or the giver of the name intended to name. Because sometimes we manage to introduce names for things that we didn't intend to name, and somehow the practice of naming that thing catches on, right? So it's not so much the intention as the fact that there is a practice that has developed and there is a chain that leads back to that introduction. That would be important. I wanted to add a couple of things only, just for background, so that the impact of your paper, your 2004 paper, can be seen against that background. In fact, for many, many years, descriptivism, the first kind of theories that Edouard was describing, were very pervasive, were practically what everybody accepted. And there is an undeniable plausibility to descriptivism when you think about how do you learn a name. We don't learn names in a vacuum. The first time that you go to a philosophy class and someone starts talking about Aristotle, your professor is going to tell you perhaps that he is the Greek philosopher that talked about hylomorphism or something of that nature. That description is what for you gives life to the name, is what makes you incorporate it into your vocabulary. And it's very natural to think, well, when you're talking about Aristotle, who are you referring to? Well, you're referring to whoever satisfies that very description that makes the name cognitively significant to you. So descriptivism was really pervasive for this and for many other reasons. But then, in 1970, something very important happened, and it's that Saul Kripke, and Keith Donelan independently came up with a series of arguments that represented extremely important blows against descriptivism. And what they noticed, or what they argued, were the following two things. On the one hand, they argued that sometimes speakers manage to refer, even though the information that they have in their minds, the properties that they associate to the name, are insufficient to just select one individual. For instance, Kripke mentions that he, in the marketplace, observes that people talk about Feynman or about Gell-Mann, but what do people associate to Feynman? Well, many people just associate famous physicist. That doesn't select one individual. Yet, when they use Feynman, they refer to Feynman, right? So the idea is that the descriptions are not necessary, right, to connect the utterance of the word, the utterance of the name to the referent. That's what became known later as the ignorance argument, the idea that people ignore many things about the reference. The name still allows them to refer to them. There's another argument, also very important. Also, Donelan and Kripke in different ways came up with the same argument. And that became known as the error argument. The idea being that sometimes speakers associate with names descriptions that do select an individual, but when they use the name, they are not referring to the individual that the description selects. The example that Kripke uses, I don't recall very well, but I think it's Columbus, right? Many people associate to Columbus the first man, the first European to set his feet in the new world. Well, that probably refers to a Viking in the 11th century, or as some people in Spain would say, it refers to some Basque person that actually went all the way to Canada to catch cod. But in any case, the idea is that Columbus refers to Columbus, even if the description actually selects someone else, even if the description in some important way is in error. And that's what became known as the error argument. Machery and colleagues' paper actually focuses on a version or on a consequence of that particular argument. Is that more or less a correct way to keep going?
Yeah, no,
okay, so you go ahead now.
Okay, good. No, that's a great setting. So indeed, so what we were interested in, we were very much influenced at the time by the work done by a psychologist called Richard Nisbett, and since the 1990s, Nisbett has been working on cultural psychology, so on differences between Eastern and Western cognition. And one of the findings he's been, and what he's been arguing, is that people in East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and people in North America and Western Europe tend to have very different cognitive styles. And one of the differences that Nisbett and his colleagues, more his colleagues than Nisbett actually, focused on was a salience of causation. And the idea is that for Westerners, North Americans, causation is very salient when North Americans have to explain things, to classify things. So causation is a very salient aspect of the world. In contrast, similarity is much more important for East Asians, for lay people in East Asia, for Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese. So we were very influenced by that research tradition, which was emerging at the end of the 1990s and at the beginning of the 21st century. And this research tradition gave us the idea that there may be differences in the way lay people react to situations of error, the kind of situations that Genoveva described a minute ago. So the idea was that because lay people in the USA or in North America are more likely to focus on causation, they may tend to agree with the judgment that a proper name refers to the causal origins of the causal chain, to the origins of the causal chain. And as a consequence, in a situation of error, they would say, well, look, a genuine mistake has been made because the proper name here refers to the individual that is at the beginning of the causal chain, despite the fact that people have mistaken beliefs about that individual, right? By contrast, we saw that people in East Asia may tend to say that, well, in fact, no mistake here has been made because the proper name here refers to the individual that, in fact, satisfies the description associated with the proper name. Yeah? So we saw that people across cultures may react to the kind of situation involving error in very different manners. And we decided at the time to just test this hypothesis. So we used one of the cases that Kripken himself in Naming a Necessity had been using, namely the Gödel case. So let me refresh your memory about the Gödel case, and it's roughly taken from Kripken. So just imagine that Gödel, in fact, was not the man who proved that arithmetic is incomplete. In fact, the theorem was proven by someone called Schmidt, who died in Vienna under mysterious circumstances. Now, Gödel, who was a friend of Schmidt, got hold of the manuscript and published the proof himself, and as a consequence, and pretended that he, and not Schmidt, pretended that he had shown that arithmetic is incomplete. Right? So we have here a situation where someone called Schmidt proves a theorem, Gödel just steals the theorem and publishes the theorem. Now, contemporary speakers, you, me, a student, for example, in a college, in a university, when he or she uses the word Gödel, the only thing she knows about Gödel, or the only thing she believes about Gödel, I should say, the only thing she's been taught about Gödel, is that Gödel is a man who proves that arithmetic is incomplete. She has no further information about Gödel. Right? So now the question is, when that individual, when that student uses the word Gödel, is she referring to the man who proves that arithmetic is incomplete? Or is she referring to the man who stole the theorem. Right? She's talking about the man who stole the theorem. If your judgment, or what philosophers call, if your intuition says that, well, when that individual uses the word Gödel, she must be talking about the man who stole the theorem, because after all, he's the one who was called Gödel. Then your intuition is in line with Kripken. You have a causal historical intuition, and you think this individual is making a mistake, is making an error about the man who was called Gödel. By contrast, if your intuition is that when this individual is using the word Gödel, she's talking about the man who proved that arithmetic is incomplete, namely the man who at the beginning was called Schmidt. Because after all, that's the only thing she knows about Gödel. Right? The only thing she believes about Gödel, I should say. Then, in that case, you're believing that this individual is not making a mistake, and you have an intuition that is in line with descriptivism. Right? You have a descriptivist intuition. Right? So our prediction at the time was that people in North America would be more likely to have causal historical intuitions than people in East Asia. People in East Asia would be more likely to have descriptivist intuitions. So people in North America would be more likely to have the kind of intuitions philosophers in North America have, the kind of intuition Kripke has, while lay people in East Asia, in China, in Korea, in Japan, would be more likely to have the opposite intuition. And since it's an empirical hypothesis, we decided to test this hypothesis. And we ran a very simple study involving two cases or two vignettes. One almost taken word by word from Kripke's Naming and Necessities, that's the Gödel case, and one which was a version of the Gödel case, but which used just a Chinese name. And for both vignettes, what we found is that exactly as we had predicted, people in the USA are much more likely than people in East Asia to have causal historical intuition. They're much more likely to say that when someone uses the word Gödel, he or she must be talking about the man who stole the theorem, the man who was originally called Gödel, than Chinese, right? And furthermore, what we find is that most Americans, in fact, have causal historical intuitions. Most Americans have the same intuitions as Kripke. By contrast, most Chinese tend to have descriptivist intuitions. Right? So we find this very, very surprising, predicted, but in some way quite puzzling difference between East Asians and North Americans in the way these two populations react to these very famous philosophical cases. Now, I have to say before giving letting Genoveva comment on these, I have to say that you must be aware that this finding has been now widely replicated. Now, the significance of this finding is incredibly controversial, and there has been an intense debate over the last 10 years about what to make of this result. But the finding itself, the idea that people using the Gödel case and versions of the Gödel case, that people in East Asia tend to have descriptivist intuitions, while people in North America tend to have causal historical intuitions, that empirical finding itself has been replicated now a few times, both in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and recently in Japan. So that's a robust finding. Now, the meaning of this finding, of course, is up for grabs. The significance of this finding is up for grabs. And Genoveva has been a very sharp and insightful critic of this result and of the significance, of the possible philosophical significance of this finding. And maybe it's time to give you the opportunity to comment, Genoveva.
Okay, so let me say a few things before talking about my main concern about that paper, because there are two issues that are not quite relevant, but they always puzzle me, and they have to do with your hypothesis, with what justifies just having this hypothesis. But see, there are two things. First of all, if I understand Nisbet's results and what he says, is not so much that Westerners are inclined to focus on causation, and East Asians are not inclined to focus on causation. What they say is that Westerners tend to single out individuals and make them the source of causal sources, whereas East Asians tend to attribute causal interactions to the background and to the field, I think he says. So the issue, it seems to me, is not so much that, according to Nisbet, according to these studies, which, by the way, they have been contested, like it's very normal, these things happen, so on. But it's not so much that Westerners should be expected to fall on the side of any theory that is causal, and East Asians should not fall on the side of any theory that is causal. It's rather that the difference lies in what these two different cultures think that the terms of the causal relation are. Right? Whether the causal relations are individual, or they are more something that is a matter of the whole background of the whole field. So that was one thing that always puzzled me, that you would have an hypothesis according to which anything that is not causal, the East Asians are going to go for, and Westerners are going to go for anything that is causal. Now, the second thing that surprises me about the hypothesis is that the so-called causal theory is just causal theory by it's called causal theory, but it's not clear how much it is causal. There is a philosopher, Michael Devitt, certainly. He took the ideas of Kripken and O'Neill and he made them into a causal theory of reference all the way through, about the introduction of the names and about the transmission of the names. But when you look at Kripken and O'Neill, what you get is a theory that tells you how language with the meaning, with how words with their meanings are passed from generation to generation. And even Kripken, there is a moment in which he says that descriptivism is a very individualistic way of thinking because from the solitude of your study, you could just say, Aristotle for me means that. It is individualistic also in the sense that a Martian anthropologist looking into your mind would know what you meant and what you referred to when you used the word. Whereas the so-called causal historical picture is a theory that, according to which a Martian anthropologist looking into your mind would not be able to figure out what it was that you were referring to, because they would have to look at where you got the name and where this other person got the name all the way back to the introduction of the name. So there is a sense in which the so-called causal historical picture, you could call it the social network picture of reference. Now, when you put things like this, it has some consequences, right? Because one of the things that Nisbet does conclude is that Westerners are much more individualistic than East Asians, that East Asians rely much more in their community. Now, I would have been less surprised by an hypothesis according to which Westerners went for the individualistic theory, descriptivism, and East Asians went for the social theory, the so-called causal historical picture. So that's a puzzlement that I think I had to say it because I never quite understood how you came up with that hypothesis. But the point is, you did your test, you got some results. The results are what they are. So let's forget about why you got that hypothesis. The results are what they are, so what happens next? My reaction to the Machery, Mallon, Nicholson, Stitch paper was to think that the kind of data that they were obtaining in those probes is not the kind of data that is relevant for semantic theorizing. When I think about what constitutes the error argument by Kripken and O'Neill, what does Kripken do? Kripken reports, rightly or wrongly, that when he sees people talking, right, they're using Columbus, the word Columbus, they're clearly talking about Columbus, the man from Spain or from Italy or from wherever he was, who actually crossed with the 3 ships and so forth and so on with the with the money collected in Spain, and so, that they're referring to that person. They are not referring to the Viking or the Basque that arrived in the coasts of the New World several centuries before. So what Kripke does is just put forward an hypothesis or a conclusion, if you wish, based on an argument that is based on observation of usage by speakers. The Gödel argument that is used in Machery, Malin, Nichols, and Stitch's paper, it's not an error argument in the same sense. It is a counterfactual story. It's not observation of use. When Kripke uses it, he's asking his audience to join him in playing the anthropologist and testing their own intuitions about what they would say in those cases. The Gödel argument is good for theorizing. It's one step up already, because what you're asking yourself is not how do these people use the names and how can I describe it. What you are asking a bunch of people is what do they think that use of that name refers to? That's a theoretical question. And that's what you guys asked in that paper. And I thought, that's doing theory already. That's not the kind of data that the semanticist wants, because it's not data about use. And my proposal was, at some point I think that I published this paper in 2009 in Analysis, and I ended the paper saying, look, why don't you just do something different? Just gave them the story, gave them the Gödel story, but at the end, say something like, well, one day the terrible truth is discovered, and John, who is the person in the story, claims, oh, Professor Gödel was a liar, I'm so upset, I'm so disappointed. And then ask the people, what do you think about John's reaction? And namely, do something that is going to allow people to use the name Gödel and see how they use it. Let's see if they say, now we know who Professor Gödel was, finally, and now we know that he was killed. And then they are going descriptivist. But if they're going to say things like, well, I never thought that Gödel would be capable of stealing the proof, then definitely they're not going descriptivist. That was my point in that 2009 paper, and it was the beginning of our debate that afterwards has gone on because, of course, Edouard and colleagues went on to respond somehow. Go ahead.
Good. So let me say a few things about. So there's a lot of things to address here. Let me say first a few things about why we came with the hypothesis we came from. So let me concede indeed that the connection between the theory and the specifics of a hypothesis, so Nisbet's and other cultural psychologists' work, and the specifics of a hypothesis, the connection is not that strong. And for a long time, I myself have been very uncertain about this cultural hypothesis. So we found a difference, but where did it come from? I've always been somewhat puzzled, and partly for the reasons you're mentioning. Two things, however. The first thing is Nisbet's and colleagues' work is fairly complex, and it depends where you look. So in some of their work, for example, in the work between Nisbet and Norenzayan, they do actually, there's a series of papers where they do ask people to do classification tasks, which can be solved in two ways, either by focusing on causal properties or by focusing on similarity. And what you do find is that Westerners are more likely to focus on causal properties to classify, while Easterners or East Asians are more likely to focus on non-causal properties, on similarity to classify. So in some of their works, they do actually focus on causation as a way of drawing causation versus something else as a way of drawing the difference. But not, you're right, not in all their research. So that's the first point. And on the other hand, I do agree with you about the social versus individualistic. It would be it's one way in which the connection between Nisbet's work and our specific predictions is actually a little bit loose. Mm-hmm. That said, recently there's been actually a bunch of recent studies that do suggest that our finding is just not simply true of people in Hong Kong. It has been replicated in at least 2 or 3 sites in mainland China. It's been replicated in Japan at least twice now. So that does seem to be something. I don't exactly know what, but that does seem to be something about a cultural hypothesis. Now, what exactly is a proper explanation? I think we don't know. I don't know for sure. I don't even have any good hypothesis to tell. So that's for the why we came with the hypothesis we decided to test. So again, a loose connection, but data do suggest that there may be something about it. Now, to address your concern, I think I've got a few things to say here, and I think I want to make them point by point and give you an opportunity to respond to each of them. So first thing to be said is, I've never been entirely sure whether you take yourself to propose a reform of the way semantics and theories of reference should be done, or whether you think you're describing the way it is done. Now, granted, Kripken, for example, sometimes focuses on the use of proper names. I think Columbus is a good example. The way the proper name Columbus is used is indeed one of the pieces of evidence is bringing to the fore against descriptivist theories. On the other hand, I think it's also true that in many places in Naming and Necessity, for example, when he talks about the Gödel case, and elsewhere as well, the same is true of Putnam and of other philosophers of language of the time, they do use the kind of counterfactual cases, and they do ask their readers to make judgments about the semantic properties of proper names instead of just using words. So what we were doing is, in a way, just following this second trend within the philosophy of language. Now, you may think that philosophers of language have been mistaken to do that kind of, to propose that kind of counterfactual stories and to ask their readers to make counterfactual judgments. So that may be your position, but then you're putting forward a very reformist stance, right? You're not simply describing the way theorizing about reference has been done. So where do you stand? Do you think your position is more a reformist position, or are you really thinking that you're basically just describing the way theorizing about reference is done?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, different people do different things.
That's right, yeah. No, true. Fair enough.
However, the two steps that you are describing, I think that they are part already of the normal practice of the philosopher of language. I think that the philosopher of language starts being a member of a community, and the philosopher of language, I see the semanticist a little bit like an anthropologist. Anthropologists talk about this thing that is called observant participation or participant observation. I don't remember. Do you remember how they call it? One of the two. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But the idea is that you're a member of the community, but you are also capable of taking 2 steps back and think about the use, reflect about the use. Well, that's what philosophers do for everything, right? I mean, take 2 steps back and reflect on many of the things that we do. Now, that constitutes the first input of the semantic theorizing. It is true that after you have a certain beginning of an hypothesis and beginning of a theory, then one of the ways in which you are going to transmit that is by coming up with these counterfactual cases, and then you're going to try to explain to people, provide these kinds of stories, and try for people to just come to your side, so to speak, develop the same intuitions that you have. But that second step is already part of the theorizing, as I see it. It's when Kripken does that in Naming and Necessity, he's with an audience of philosophers, probably linguists, and so on. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to create the same theoretical intuitions, or I wouldn't say theoretical yet, because they're still at a very initial level. But he's trying to just create the same intuitions that are going to lead them to a certain theory. So that's the way I see it. I don't think that I'm being reformist in the sense that I'm thinking or I'm proposing in any way that what philosophers should do is just go out and just purely describe the practice. because I think that the philosopher is a little bit in the position in which, say, an anthropologist who's trying to describe the norms that a community abides for, non-written norms that a community abides for, and is just in that community, and he's trying to see how people react and act, but he's trying to come up with something that is normative, and so I think that the philosopher is already doing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, I quite agree actually that the philosopher is actually focusing in part on use, so I surely would not deny that point. So I do agree indeed that philosophers is already doing that. I guess I'm disagreeing about the suggestion that cases such as the Gödel case or the Martini case in Donolan, all these famous philosophy cases are just part of a process of trying to convince other people, a theorizing process. It strikes me they're also part of the collection of pieces of evidence that are relevant for theorizing. And I suppose we slightly are reading these cases in a different manner. All right, so let's move. Let's move to my second.
So let me say something that I agree with that. Okay. We have that disagreement that is important to highlight, because it's a disagreement about what kind of position these kinds of cases occupy in the process. Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I think that's a
fair one. Yeah.
Point where you and I disagree about understanding these cases. Now let me move to a second response I'm tempted to make when I hear your objection. Again, I want to say it's a very insightful objection, and I think it does raise very important issues for how to do philosophy of language and how to theorize about reference. So a second concern I have is, well, it would be really surprising if counterfactual judgments were not a good tool or a good means or a good way at getting at the semantic properties of words, right? It would be, all these, I mean, it's not simply that counterfactual judgments. They're judgments, they're also metalinguistic judgment, right? They're judgment about the semantic properties of words. What does a proper name Gödel refers to? That kind of question. Now, it would be really surprising if this metalinguistic judgment were not as good evidence for the semantic properties of words as use. And I think for two distinct reasons, really quite distinct reasons. The first one is that, well, people use words all the time, we use proper names all the time, and it's plausible anyway that we have developed some kind of implicit theory about how proper names work, and it's plausible that this implicit theory is by and large right? After all, we get a lot of feedback when we use proper names in the wrong way. So, and this metalinguistic judgment seem to be the expression of this implicit theory. I think that's something you would agree with. But if that's true, then these metalinguistic judgments are by and large likely to be true. They're likely to give us good information about the semantic properties of words. So that's one reason why it strikes me it would be really puzzling to just dismiss these metalinguistic judgments as if they were not as important as use. So that's the first argument. And the second argument, which is one I've been pressing for a few years, it seems that in the case of reference, if you're right, there would be really something peculiar going on. Because if you look in other aspects of language, metalinguistic judgments tend to be very reliable sources of evidence with respect to the linguistic properties of words. So if you do syntax, you're going to use judgments of acceptability. Right? It's a metalinguistic judgment, and that's really a good piece of evidence for the syntactic properties of grammatical constructions. If you work on lexical semantics, right, you're going to use judgments about synonymy, antonymy, right? And these judgments are metalinguistic judgments, and they're really good pieces of evidence about the meaning of words, right? So there's in other parts of linguistics, in other areas of linguistics, there's a connection between people's metalinguistic judgments and the linguistic properties of words or grammatical constructions, right? Syntactic or semantic. Now, if you're right, there's something really peculiar about reference, such that there's something fishy about judgments about reference, that we can't use them to know or to form justified theories about reference itself. And this asymmetry at least calls for an explanation, I would say. So that's my second point. My second point, again, it would be really surprising if these metalinguistic judgments about counterfactual situation were not as useful pieces of evidence as used when one is theorizing about reference, for these two distinct reasons. We likely have good theories, probably implicit theories that we use when we make that, and also there will be this kind of asymmetry between other parts of linguistics and theories of reference. So that's always the reason why, at least, I've got a third argument, which I'll come to in a minute, but that's a second reason for me to resist your objection.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, sorry. I thought that we were, for a moment, I thought that we were disconnected again. It sounded very strange. All right. Let me see. Several things. Let me say something. I'm not dismissing what you call metalinguistic judgments. I don't call them metalinguistic judgments. I call them judgments about use, right? Reflections about use, which is what I think the theorist does. I don't dismiss those reflections about use, but I think that they're important. I think that they're an important part of the theory. I think, for instance, that the Putnam twin earth cases are definitely testing that kind of counterfactual situation about a reflection about the application of words. I think that the Gödel case is a very important case. So I'm not dismissing them in the theory. I'm just situating them in a different position because I think that they play a different role in a path already towards making the theory. But that leads us to another topic. That is a topic that I don't know that we will have time to get into, which is a topic that is not just about experimental semantics. It's much more general, right? And it's the question of who are making those judgments. The audience that Kripke is addressing in Naming a Necessity and presenting the Gödel case to is an audience of people who are in a position, it seems to me, to start making these kinds of theoretical judgments. I'm not entirely sure that a bunch of undergraduates in Hong Kong and Rutgers are in a position to giving us judgments that are going to be useful in that sense. But that, of course, is what takes us to this question about, well, whose intuitions are going to count, who are about these kinds of questions, about the questions that require a reflection about use, not just the use itself. That leads us to what is called the expertise problem. I don't know if we're going to have time to get into that, but just let me, with what I said, I think that you can more or less see in which direction I am going here, right? The other issue about the other aspects of language. It may be that they are entirely different. That connects with what I said with what I said before. Of course, these intuitions play a very important role. Of course, they play a very important role. Observe that when people have intuition about what's correct or incorrect, sometimes they may reflect and tell you that something is correct. Still, their practice. In the practice, they use something that they, on reflection, think that is incorrect. When people, for instance, reflect about things like rules of reasoning, upon reflection, everybody seems very reasonable. In reality, not everybody, but many people seem very reasonable that in reality are going to do things that are not, that do not accord with their judgment of reasonability. Now, I think that that's one situation that we have in the use of language. One thing is the use of language that constitutes the first input for the semanticist, and a different thing is a reflection on the use. So that's why I was saying, but that's what I wanted to say about this topic. There's one thing also that perhaps now is when you want to go in, because you were already working in the direction of thinking, well, you have these two types of judgments, what you call linguistic and metalinguistic, what I call judgments about use and just the use. And I guess that what you want to work towards is towards the point in which you want to say, but look, there's going to be coincidence, right? Which was essentially your response. So perhaps you can go ahead and explain that, yeah.
Yeah, good. So that's the third point. So I was basically giving some in a sense, plausibility arguments about why we would expect people's judgments about use and use to basically coincide with one another. I agree with you, I don't think any of these arguments is a decisive argument. They may be actually, or implicit series may be false, as you gave the example of rationality is, I think, perfectly right. So we may have false implicit theories, and reference may be very different from syntactic properties or grammatical properties or from meaning. So I don't think any of this argument is decisive. But I think at least the way I was looking at them was they were giving me a reason to expect a coincidence between judgment about use and use. And that's the third point I wanted to make. So in a response to Genoveva's really influential paper in analysis, together with two colleagues of mine, Chris Olivola, who is a psychologist here at Carnegie Mellon University, and Molly DeBlanc, who was then an undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh, we published a response also in analysis in 2009, I believe, where we tried to provide evidence that, in fact, use and judgment about use, or what I call metalinguistic judgments and non-metalinguistic judgment, or first-order judgment, that these two types of judgment fit with one another. And here's the way we tried to do it. So we designed two vignettes. The first one was a version of the Gödel case using Chinese names, the Tu Chung Chi case. And the Tu Chung Chi case is about an astronomer who makes an astronomical discovery. He dies. His discovery is stolen by someone else. And when someone uses the proper name of that other person, who is a modern speaker talking about? The man who discovered the astronomical fact, or the man who stole the astronomical fact. Same structure as the Gödel case, different names. Right? And in one condition, people were asked to make a judgment about reference. So people were asked when someone nowadays uses the word, the proper name Tzu Chun Chi, is he or she talking about, and then we have the two options, right? The man who has shown the astronomical fact, or the man who has stolen this discovery, right? Exactly the kind of question we had asked in the 2004 paper. Now, in the second condition, we asked subjects to make a judgment about truth, about the truth value of a sentence. And here is the question we asked. We asked the following question to subject. Having read the above story and accepting that it is true, when Ivy, with the name of a modern speaker, says Tzu Chung Chi was a great astronomer, so that's a sentence, do you think that her claim is A, true, or B, false? Right, so we ask her to make a judgment about the truth value of a sentence. The idea here is that if people tend to have a descriptivist intuition, they're likely to say that the sentence was true, right? They're not making a mistake, they're not making an error. To come back to the beginning of the discussion, if people have causal historical intuition, they're likely to say that the sentence was false, right? Because Tzu Chun Chi, the proper name, refers to the individual who stole the astronomical discovery, not the one who made it, right? And what we did, then we had these two conditions, one asking a judgment about reference, another one asking a judgment about truth value. And what we did, we compared in 4 different countries, whether the proportion of descriptivist answer in the first condition and the proportion of descriptivist answers in the second condition, right, were similar. And what we found is that in both India, Mongolia, France, and the USA, what we found is that in these 4 countries, the proportion of people who were making descriptivist judgments in the first condition, the one where we're asking about reference, and in the second condition, the one where we're asking about truth value, these proportions are very, very similar to one another. So, for example, in France, about 55% of people, if I remember correctly, about 50% of people make descriptivist judgments for the first condition when they ask about reference, and also 50% of people make descriptivist judgment when they ask about truth value. In India, about 60% of people make Kripken judgments when they ask about reference, and also about 60% of people make Kripken judgment or causal historical judgment when they ask about truth value. So what we saw, the way we thought about this data, we saw some kind of coincidence indeed in people's disposition to use words as measured by the second condition, judgments about truth value, and also people's disposition to make judgment about use, to make metalinguistic judgment, as assessed by the first condition, right? And so we have a coincidence between judgment about use and between use. Exactly the kind of findings that the plausibility arguments I was mentioning to earlier were leading to. So that was the gist of the response to Genoveva's point. We saw Genoveva was right to draw a distinction between use and judgment about use. We were skeptical of the idea that judgment about use and use would not coincide with one another, and we tried to provide some evidence that, as a matter of fact, they do coincide with one another. That was our point. Genoveva?
Yes, exactly. That's good description of what happened. Let me see. That paper that appeared in Analysis also in 2009. And let me just say a few things about it. First, the paper, as it is in Analysis, it's only 3 countries. It's Mongolia, France, and India. There's not a fourth one. There is the USA. Perhaps you did something else later, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But the idea of the paper was, I mean, it was clear. I mean, right? I mean, I had raised a concern. The concern being that one thing is to test what people say when they reflect about use, and another thing is to collect data from use. What the semanticist needs to do is the data from use. Just give us the data from use, not the data about what people think about use. So Edouard and colleagues devised these 2 vignettes. The 2 vignettes were supposed to just provide people with questions. Some of them were supposed to collect data about use, the other ones were supposed to collect judgments about use. And if there was a coincidence, then that should allay my concerns, because that meant that from now on, people can go on doing the same kind of probes that had been done originally, because anything or mostly what people say when they reflect about use is going to also give us an input about how they actually do use. So that definitely should be the end of my concern. Well, what happens here? Several things. I want to observe several things. First, some of them are a little bit, I don't want to get into technical details. I've always tried not to question technical issues. But there's one thing that if you look at the paper and you look at the chart, one thing that you see is that there's a tendency to what Edouard and colleagues call Kripken judgments, when the question is a question about truth or falsity. Yeah? Do you believe that he's saying something true? Do you believe that he's saying something false? Now, there's a tendency in all 3 populations. That tendency never reaches significance. But after Nate Silver's, one of the things that I think we've learned is that whenever you have a certain tendency, even if it's within the margin of error, test again. I have a few technical concerns about that probe, because also the samples are rather small. There's sometimes 80-something people that are divided in 2, but also it's not only that they are rather small, they are inconsistent in the sense that for instance, I think that this one of the groups that is given one of the questions in France has only 16 people, whereas in Mongolia and in India, they're pretty evenly divided. You have like 40 on one side, 47 on another. So when you have these kind of mismatches, I think to me it generates some concern, because a minor change when you have a population of 16 people, just a mistake, is going to have a much larger impact. But all these things are just rather technical. My concern about this second paper was that, well, let me put it like this, it was the same as was the first paper. Because what I thought was happening was that they continued to ask the participants in the experiment to reflect about use, to reflect about some speaker that is in a certain situation that has learned a name in a certain way, and then something has happened, and then they're being asked to reflect about their use. Actually, there was something rather funny that for a while there was a blog and the thread had the title, "Did Marti refute Machery and colleagues on reference?" Do you remember that, Edouard?
Not really, but
no, because you have been in many. But I discovered it much later when the thread was already closed, and then I was famous for a while. I didn't know it, and that thread was precisely about this second paper. And you presented the results in that thread. And actually, Chalmers was one of the first people to intervene. And he said, the second test is equally metalinguistic. You are asking them to reflect about use. And I remember that for a long time, people were telling me, look, you should respond to this second paper because people are going to think that you agree with them. And I was telling them, I can't respond, because Chalmers already said everything, and not even analysis is going to accept a paper that short. But the thing is that then I ended up responding, and I ended up responding with a very long paper, unfortunately, that came up in a volume published in MIT by Michael O'Rourke, and some other author that I forget, whose name I forget now. Keva Sanchez, thing is his name. Anyway, but I will reply. Essentially was, in short, is that you're still asking in the second one to reflect about use, and that's what I think that it's just not giving us the kind of input that is important for semantic theorizing. Let me say one thing though about that paper that I found rather interesting, is that one thing about the first paper is that you were talking a lot about the cultural differences, but one thing that if anything has been established by other studies is that, and your own, is that there is a lot of intracultural variation. I mean, even in the same culture, people have very different intuitions when they reflect about use, and I think that that's an important thing. Also, something that called my attention about that test is that among the three populations, the French were the most descriptivist. I know that in that paper was not designed, that probe was not designed to test the cross-cultural claim. It was designed to test whether there was a match between reflections about use and use, which I didn't think was well done. But what caught my attention in this is that if you look at the chart, you will see that the French are the most descriptivist of the lot, much more than Mongolians and Indians that are pretty much similar. And last time I checked, the French were not East Asians. So this goes to say that there's a lot of intracultural variation. Even some people later have suggested, like there's this paper by Pinillos and I think it's Stitch also, that is called ambiguous reference. And there's something by
Nichols.
Okay. It's three authors, but I don't remember now.
Malone.
Right, exactly. And there's also a paper, I think, by Genon and Lombroso that what they do suggest is that even individual speakers, depending on the situation, will have intuitions that go one direction and another, which I don't find at all surprising.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Good. So a few things. I mean, I think it would be worse to replicate the experiment. I don't remember having 16 subjects in one condition, but I should double check about that. And it's true the samples are not huge, but 40 per each condition is not small either.
No, it's not small.
It would be better to replicate the study, and I think it calls indeed at the very least for replication. So I'm happy to continue that point. But let me just address the two. First the point about the French being the most descriptive. No, that is true. But I've always thought French were really East Asians. So,
well, I mean, you know better.
Exactly. More seriously, it's still the fact. I mean, there's a lot of variation within culture, but it's still the fact that most French actually have Kripken intuitions, right? So even so, they're the most descriptivists. They still have overall. I mean, the majority of French in this vignette. For these two vignettes, report.
I'm really not that sure about that, but it's maybe pretty even. Yes. Okay, just go ahead. Sorry.
It's about 50, and that's much more than what you find in Asia. And in India and Asia tend to be quite different cultural contexts.
Yes.
But I agree. There's probably more to be said there. I think the real concern is the one about the fact that asking people to make a judgment about truth values, a metalinguistic judgment. Now we do mention. I mean, in all fairness, we do talk about that in the paper, right? It's not like Chalmers just made a point that we had notice in the paper. So we do comment on that aspect in the paper. And the reason why we use a metalinguistic judgment is because we had this idea that if someone says that a specific sentence is true, he or she is disposed to use that sentence. So we use this, in a sense, auxiliary principle that if I say a specific sentence is true, then I'm disposed to use that sentence. Now, there are obvious counterexamples to that principle. For example, when you've got indexicals and demonstrative, right? Then you're not going. Then, of course, the fact that you said that a sentence is true, which a sentence uttered by someone else, which includes some indexicals or demonstrative, is true, you're not disposed to use that very sentence, right? But that's not one of these sentences, right? It's not one of these sentences that violates this very reasonable principle that if you say a sentence is true, very likely you're disposed to utter that sentence. So we thought using a metalinguistic judgment of the form truth, asking people to assess the true value of a uttered sentence, was at least for a first pass a good proxy for looking at use. I concede the point, it's just a proxy, but it is still a proxy. That's what I wanted to say. And the second point is that let's not exaggerate how difficult it is to make that kind of judgment. After all, people make judgments about truth and falsehood all the time, right? They judge whether what people say is true or false. It does not require much theorizing to do that. It's part, actually, of our everyday linguistic practices to engage in the assessment of truth and falsehood, truth and falsity. So I want to resist a little bit the idea that it is a metalinguistic judgment, obviously, right? It's one which is tightly connected to the disposition to use, except in specific circumstances. And it's not very theoretical. It's really part of our linguistic practices. Right? So I agree. It's not optimal. I think indeed what I would need to do next to address your concern would be really looking at very clear instances of use, and that would be better. But I think this study at least gets at something. So that's my reaction to your criticisms.
Right. The issue about the truth, the question that asks about truth and falsity, there's one thing that needs to be said in fairness, and is that intuitions about truth conditions are important. And we all assume, I think, that by and large, speakers of a community share intuitions about truth conditions. Right? Because otherwise, it's not clear how we will interact. If when I say something, I didn't expect you to have something roughly similar to what I have in mind when I think that the conditions under which this is true or false. My point is that also about that particular point is that one thing is to have the intuitions about truth conditions that are revealed in behavior. So my question is always about look at the behavior. And another thing is to express them correctly. I always go back to the issues about rationality and things of that nature. So I think that there's still that mismatch there. In any case, listen, we said that we would try to make it short and sweet so that people wouldn't get bored, and we have been talking for over an hour. So do you think that we should just say that people already have an idea of what we said, how we disagree, and if they want to see the next debate, in the book we debate even a little more, right?
Absolutely. So I think we've covered basically much of the points where we agree, much of the points where we disagree, and I think if people are interested in the debate, first, we've published quite a fair amount on the topic by now. And also, there's indeed these 2 chapters in Current Controversies in Experimental Philosophy that people can be can consult and can read. All right.
Excellent.
So thank you, Genoveva. It has been really a pleasure to talk to you this morning. And
Same here.
Have a beautiful day.